Get started. Let's begin today's program entitled Vision, Innovation, and Action to Address Child Marriage. My name is Sandeep Bathala. I'm a Senior Program Associate with the Environmental Change and Security Program, as well as the Global Health Initiative here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. ECSP, or the Environmental Change and Security Program, is 19 years old, and we look at the various connections between health, environment, livelihoods, population, and security. Today's meeting is brought to you as part of our HELPS project. HELPS is a 5-year initiative that's generously supported by USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health. The Center's Global Health Initiative, also known as GSI, works to address many critical and neglected maternal health issues as well, and so that's why we have those two programs working on today's event. As many of you know, the Wilson Center is a formal memorial to our 28th president, the only president thus far to have achieved a PhD, and in his honor, we aim to bring the worlds of policy, practice, and academia together to better inform one another. A note about today's meeting: it is being webcasted live, so when we do come to the discussion part, I'd ask that anybody who asks a question to use a mic. Please do so that folks tuning in can hear you, and I'd ask you to introduce yourself and your affiliation. Before I turn it over to our esteemed moderator, Michal Avni, Senior Gender Advisor at USAID, I want to thank USAID, the Interagency Gender Working Group's Task Force on Gender-Based Violence, and its co-chairs, Population Reference Bureau and CARE, for co-sponsoring today's event and putting a lot of hard work behind it. So thank you for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion. And Michal, it's all yours.
Thank you, Sandeep, and thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting this great event today. I'm delighted to see such a great turnout, so many people who are really interested in this very important topic. We have a great lineup of speakers today, and we've decided to divide them into two separate panels to make it all manageable, and the topics lend themselves nicely to being divided into two, so that's great. I will start by introducing the first panel, and then we will go ahead, they will present, and we will have a short question and answer session before moving on to the second panel. I do just want to say that one of our speakers, Carla Coppell, will have to leave by a little bit before 3 in order to get to another engagement, so she may or may not be able to stay for the Q&A session. Hopefully that'll be okay. So let me start by introducing Carla Coppell. She is the United States Agency for International Development Chief Strategy Officer. In this role, she's creating, communicating, and executing strategic initiatives across the agency, focused particularly on improving Bureau strategic planning and management for results. Prior to serving as CSO, Carla Coppell served as USAID's first senior coordinator for gender equality and women's empowerment and a senior advisor to the USAID administrator. Under her leadership, USAID developed a new gender equality and female empowerment policy, as well as specific agency-wide strategies and plans for advancing the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, and the U.S. Strategy for Preventing and Combating Gender-Based Violence. Carla Coppell served as USAID's representative to the White House Council on Women and Girls and contributed to government-wide efforts ensuring gender equality and women's empowerment are core goals of U.S. foreign policy. You also have longer bios for each one of our speakers, so I will leave it at that, although there are many things to note for our speakers today. Jennifer Redner is Senior Program Officer at the U.S. Foreign Policy and Advocacy at the International Women's Health Coalition. Her work focuses on improving policies, funding, and programs to secure the health and rights of women and young women around the world. Young people around the world, sorry. To achieve this goal, Jennifer Redner is a leader in a number of technical and advocacy coalitions and working groups. She speaks regularly in public forums, designs and executes trainings, provides radio and print and television interviews. Jennifer also educates members of Congress and administration officials about the importance of the benefits gained from investing in women and girls. She previously worked for organizations such as the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation, the Population Council, and the International Center on Women for Research on Women. Dr. Anju Malhotra is Principal Advisor on Gender and Rights at UNICEF, where she leads strategy, programming, and policy to overcome the barriers to children's well-being and rights presented by gender inequality and human rights violations. She has an extensive research portfolio focusing on issues such as child marriage, girls' education, innovation and women's empowerment, adolescent transition to adulthood, sex selection, reproductive health and rights, and technology's role in economically empowering women. Dr. Malhotra has served as an expert on child marriage to the Elders Foundation and currently serves on the advisory board of Girls Not Brides Alliance. Thank you. Please, Carla.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see such a nice full room of people dedicated to thinking about child marriage for a few hours. Such an important topic. I have to start by saying it's always a great pleasure, particularly to come and speak at the Wilson Center, because I worked here once upon a time, so it always feels slightly like coming home. But I wanted to thank the Wilson Center for hosting and helping organize the event, as well as the Interagency Gender Working Group, which I know plays such an unbelievably important convening role for a very large community of practice with a diverse range of interests. I'm happy to be here, and as I was coming here, I was thinking, you know, when I think about child marriage, what is the first thing that comes to my mind today? And for me, it's really about the early and forced marriage that we're seeing in Syria, and as a result of the Syria crisis, and how we confront and combat this challenge, both within the context of countries that have a tradition and a history of early marriage, and those that have early and forced marriage born of crisis and conflict and disaster. And I mention that to say that we're really focused on how we deal with these issues in very much real time within the U.S. government these days, and that that said, we don't have all the answers, and we're really eager to enable conversation and dialogue like this so that we can learn collectively. As I hope most of you are aware, U.S. Agency for International Development has undergone a complete overhaul and reform of policies and strategies related to not just early marriage or child marriage, but to gender equality and female empowerment writ large. And the reason I mention that, and we'll quickly, I promise, telescope down to child marriage, is that we really view all of these policies and strategies as nested in one another and born of one another and completely consistent with one another. And that's an important point to make, because what we're really trying to do is weave a fabric that makes it impossible not to pay attention to these issues and to integrate attention to these issues in all that we as a foreign assistance agency do. And so we could talk about our gender equality and female empowerment policy, which just passed its first anniversary. We could talk about the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, which indeed focuses on issues such as the crisis in Syria and what that means for women and girls. But I will focus particularly on how we are both implementing the U.S. government's strategy for preventing and combating gender-based violence globally, and then USAID's vision for preventing and combating child and early marriage, as well as meeting the needs of married children. I will do my own little Vanna thing and tell you that I had asked that copies be brought. I don't know if they're there, but this is available online and gives you a good sense of how, when you think about the broad range of different types of gender-based violence that exist, child marriage is nested in that broader conversation. And in this document, in this strategy, is really an attempt to focus on what that means concretely. So what does it mean for us? Well, for us, it means, first of all, what are our principles for engagement? How do we cultivate partnerships? Because we recognize that this is not something either we can do alone as one development assistance agency, nor is it something that any entity can do alone. It takes a partnership between men and women, females and males. It takes partnerships with communities, with religious leaders, with authorities enforcing laws, with private sector entities across the board. The second is that we believe that in order to change those norms, we really do need to mobilize communities writ large, and that needs to be something which is homegrown. And so as the U.S. Agency for International Development, our goal is always to be giving voice to voices within societies that are pushing for this kind of change and this type of transformation. And then we need to remember that it's critical that we not only focus on issues relating to preventing child marriage, but also to meeting the needs of married children. Because there are such a large number of people who are married under the age of 18, and that we know that they are among the most vulnerable. And so if we focus solely on prevention, we are missing a large segment of the population that really needs attention. Now, that's interesting, I will say, as an aside, because most of the time we're focused too much with gender-based violence on treatment and not on prevention. And in this case, we risk to focus on prevention and not serving those who are already married. But we know that for women and their children who have been married under 18, that the risk of mortality is 5 times greater when they're giving birth. And so we know that the consequences of not dealing with married children are very severe. For us, what we've been engaged in, whether this is for the gender-based violence strategy writ large or for our child marriage vision, is in identifying how we prioritize where we take action. Because what we're trying to do is identify the places where we can be transformative and really make a difference. And so we're looking at, areas where there are high prevalence rates, but we're also looking at places plagued by vulnerability from instability, because we know that creates challenges. And I mentioned Syria, but I could have also mentioned and will the Horn of Africa drought relief effort, where we saw also girls often being married off to help support their families when there was scarcity around. And so we know that that's a particular moment of time when there is greater risk. And then finally, we want to look for other stakeholders in their presence, because we recognize, and particularly in a time of scarce resources, that we want to leverage and work with other stakeholders. For us, in combating child marriage, the keys are integration, and how we work on integrating a focus on child marriage into the work that we're doing in a variety of sectors, whether that's about enforcing laws on the books, whether that's about providing treatment where we're providing health treatment in other sectors, whether that's thinking about how we're doing behavior change communication and how that can be part of the message, that whether it's about integrating attention to gender issues in the education system and making sure that we're focused on child marriage as part of the suite of issues we're addressing when we're talking about gender issues writ large. The second is girls' education. Because we know that girls' education and girls being enrolled in school not only puts off the marital age significantly, but it also results in greater empowerment for girls and increasing their voice within their own family, community, and society, so that they have an ability to put off that marriage better or to a greater extent. The third is, we really think, and I mentioned this already, that supporting and paying attention to married kids is essential, that we must enact and then enforce laws and policies. And it's been very interesting to look. We created, and I'll talk a bit more about it, an incentive fund for enabling our missions to engage around issues related to gender-based violence and child marriage. And very interesting in the process of the evaluation of the proposals to see how the tension that exists between people that honestly believe that different interventions are more important or more effective, and recognizing that part of it is around the health sector, that part of it is around the education sector, that part of it is around the judicial sector and law enforcement, and how those things come together to really create the web that will make the difference and end child marriage forever. And then finally, we also believe that community mobilization, as I mentioned, and outreach are going to be critical. And that really gets to this issue of how you make change. So where are we now? Beautiful vision. We're in the process of finalizing the identification of priority countries, And that's not just based on prevalence data, although prevalence data is important, and child marriage is one of the forms of gender-based violence that we have particularly focused on in looking at prevalence. It's also about the levels of engagement and ability of civil society and governments and countries, the level of government will to address these issues, the presence and role of other donors within that space, the kinds of programs that exist on the ground, the ability we have to be transformative with the resources we have. And those are all factored into the identification of those key countries. The second is to increase the allocation of resources and jumpstart those investments. And as I mentioned, we've created this incentive fund. We were very pleased that in the first year of the incentive fund, we had almost 30 proposals come in from our field missions around the world, dealing with different forms of gender-based violence, but there are specifically proposals in there related to child marriage. And we were really emphasizing two things: integration into these variety of sectors, and the scale up of existing initiatives that have demonstrated results. Then we are working very hard on the refinement of our own data and making sure we're very clear not only on what kinds of programming we're doing, but to what effect. And what is the scope for monitoring and evaluating and building on the results from that monitoring evaluation to improve our own research efforts and improve our own programmatic efforts. And then finally, or not finally, but I would mention fourth, a very robust research agenda, because what we've found is that for those who, like us, who are practitioners, we really do need more evidence about how to approach these interventions in ways that can be successful. And so we've focused, there are 3 robust programs that we have that have focused specifically on child marriage, and we're eagerly awaiting the results of those programs. One is collaboration with the Population Council on a 5-year, $5 million program called Building on the Evidence Base to Delay Marriage in Sub-Saharan Africa. And that's working in Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Burkina Faso to address the multiple drivers of child marriage and look at how different components, different intervention components make more or less difference. The second is a program that we're undertaking in cooperation with the International Center for Research on Women, which is a $3.7 million 5-year agreement to look specifically at a program in Haryana, India, that involved savings bonds that would become due once a girl reached 18 and was educated and not married. And we're looking forward to seeing whether that's an effective way of moving the needle in terms of the age of marriage for girls in India, but more generally around the world. And the third is a USAID Bangladesh pilot program that builds on UNICEF's conditional cash transfer program and includes incentives to delay marriage and keep girls in school, livelihood training for those girls, and economic development opportunities for family, as well as advocacy campaigns that target opinion leaders. And we really very much want to see the results of these very significant concrete research efforts to enable us to guide our investments moving forward. More broadly, I should mention, we have a research agenda dedicated to gender-based violence, which we've been trying to fill gaps in that area as well. And it includes, among those research projects, one on how you work with male allies and what the best ways are to engage male allies, whether those are members of communities and families, religious leaders, men who are predominant in the justice or security sectors. We're looking at the relief to development continuum and how you combat effectively gender-based violence within that space. And then finally, how economic empowerment programs for women and girls can have positive effects in decreasing gender-based violence, and when do they have negative externalities that result in increases of gender-based violence. Because the last thing that we want to do is inadvertently increase the risk of gender-based violence as part of a renewed push to foster women and girls' economic empowerment. I hope that gives you a good sense of how we're looking at this issue. We are at the beginning, but we're moving forward with enormous support and interest from within the agency. I hope I'm here to take your questions, but otherwise really at least look forward to hearing the other 2 presentations. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for joining this conversation.
Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks to the Interagency Gender Working Group for inviting me to participate in this discussion, and of course to the Wilson Center for hosting this important event. It's really a pleasure to have spoken after you, Carla, and to hear about all of the vision for action and action that's taking place within USAID and among the various agencies. And today I was asked to come and speak about Girls Not Brides USA and the work that we've been doing to help catalyze interest, awareness, and commitment to end child marriage. Next slide, please. Yeah. So the Girls Not Brides USA is co-chaired by the International Women's Health Coalition, ICRW, and CARE. And we're comprised of more than 40 organizations working across the country, and including in our own country where child marriage does exist. And we're also part of a larger global network of organizations called Girls Not Brides, the Global Partnership to End Child Marriage, which was launched in 2011 by the elders. Our coalition has been working together many years prior to 2011. I'll go through the timeline a little bit in a moment. But really, we've been collaborating. The development of this global network really expanded the efforts, attention, and global commitment towards ending this issue. And we really appreciate the opportunity to work with so many organizations around the world, including local Indigenous organizations working to change the practice in their own country. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, our coalition has been working together for many years, somewhat loosely formed in its beginning, but you'll see back in the 109th Congress that Senators Durbin and Chuck Hagel introduced legislation for the first time in the 109th, which, for those of you who don't know, we are in the 113th Congress. And each Congress is comprised of 2 years, so you do the math. And we really wouldn't be where we are today if it weren't for the stalwart and steadfast leadership of our congressional champions, including Senators Durbin, Senator Snowe, Representative McCollum, and more recently, Representative Schock. And just next slide, please. Just to give you a little more background on some of the wins we've had over the years. You'll see that in both 2010 and 2012, the Senate succeeded in unanimous passage of the International Protecting Girls by Preventing Child Marriage Act, long name. But really, all of this work culminated into a really big win in 2013. And to be frank, it was a win for women and girls living both here in the United States and overseas. This was really a day that we should all be proud of. And in fact, the inclusion of these provisions were a major coup and victory. And again, we really thank our congressional champions for their steadfast leadership. You'll see that part of the provisions required the establishment of a multi-year and multi-sectoral strategy to combat child marriage. Next slide, please. There's 5 required elements of the strategy, one of which is to prevent child marriage, promote empowerment of girls, address their unique needs, target areas with high prevalence, and include both diplomatic and programmatic initiatives. If all of these elements are included in a robust and comprehensive strategy, and its implementation is fully funded, the U.S. will succeed in its efforts as a leader and a partner on this important issue. A coordinated and focused effort to build girls' health, social, and economic assets and promote gender equitable and pro-girl social norms can move us towards our common goal of not only preventing child marriage and supporting married adolescent girls, but towards ensuring that all girls have the opportunity to live healthy, educated, safe, and empowered lives. The strategy also represents an important opportunity to identify the most crucial programmatic and geographic opportunities for investing, and answering 2 questions, which Carla clearly is already thinking about. What do we do, and where do we do it? We need to say, and as everyone knows, there can't be one generic strategy for all girls at risk of child marriage. And if we did so, it wouldn't be that game changer that all of these girls are waiting for. Specific strategies and interventions will need to be developed based on an analytical approach, much of which was described by Carla, that includes an analysis of the context, gaps, and opportunities in specific national and subnational hotspots to reach the girls most in need. In this particular context, hotspots are national and subnational locales with high concentrations of girls at risk of child marriage and generally high concentrations of married girls as well. Next slide, please. So some of the key principles, many of which were espoused in the Vision for Action, but bear repeating in terms of what Girls Not Brides USA feels are critical principles to be espoused by any donor doing work in this area, is in order to create these targeted strategies and interventions, partnerships in the form of multi-year programs should foster national and local governments and non-governmental organizations' investments in locales or these key hotspots. They should also leverage the expertise of international institutions and experts. It's critical for non-governmental partners, and in particular local indigenous organizations, to identify the most effective local government authorities to work with. And we should also ensure that girls are the direct beneficiaries of substantially expanded girl-centered programs, as well as meaningful participants in programs that meet mixed groups such as gender and age, and should be evaluated based on specific girl-level indicators. Finally, it is important that we view positive changes for girls as the ultimate outcome of our efforts, not just to delay marriage till they're 18 years old, but to ensure that a girl can marry with free, full, and informed consent. Changing social norms requires working with and through family and community members. However, it is important that girls are the ultimate client of our collective efforts. As such, indicators must be developed and tracked that capture changes at the level of individual girls. Next slide, please. So this has opportunities to strengthen the U.S. response, but really when we're looking at when donors are deciding whether it's multilateral institutions, the World Bank or others, there's some thoughts that Girls Not Brides USA wants to share about ways to strengthen a response. So in order for the U.S. or any donor's effort in this area to be as impactful as possible, we must strengthen our response to child marriage through a number of ways. First of all, we must improve coordination, which again is very echoing the calls of the Vision for Action Gender-Based Violence Strategy as well. In the context of the United States in particular, an interagency working group on child marriage could be established, which would be helpful in sharing information and best practices, making recommendations for the multi-year and multi-sectoral strategy to end child marriage, and incorporate elements of successful programs and research into cross-agency programs and initiatives throughout the implementation of this strategy. The U.S. government and others should catalyze and coordinate investments from governments, private foundations, corporations, multilateral institutions, and civil society in early and forced marriage prevention efforts and to support married adolescent girls. There also needs to be a focus on integration of child marriage into existing policy, programs, and research. In assessing the current status of responses to early and forced marriage, we must answer the questions: where are the current investments coming from? Where are they being made? From a geographic and substantive standpoint, including programmatic policy and research, what are the gaps? We must also assess commitments in sectors such as health and education that can be effectively leveraged to advance the goals of those sectors and also reducing rates of early and forced marriage. Once this assessment has been determined, we must establish a financial target. What do we need every year to be meeting as many of the needs of married and unmarried girls at risk for child marriage? We need to ensure that strategies and plans of other appropriate agencies, sub-agencies, initiatives, donors in the country include the prevention and mitigation of early and forced marriage as explicit goals with measurable targets. Girls Not Brides USA recognizes that it's imperative to reach the most marginalized and at-risk girls, and that one way to do this is through robust data collection, analysis, and use. We need to assess and build on data available through various systems, including the demographic health surveys, to gather meaningful trends of data, whether it be on child marriage, as well as assessing the possibility of adding additional questions. We need to link and analyze the correlation of child marriage indicators with other indicators, including educational attainment and performance, age of first pregnancy and first birth. We must also invest in strong monitoring and evaluation systems from the outset of program design for all programs and include age of marriage as a key outcome area across these funded programs. With enhanced coordination, integration, and data collection and use, programming can become more impactful and reach more and more of the most marginalized and at-risk girls. In this regard, efforts should be made to design and implement new programs where there have not been investments to date, with an emphasis on scale and evaluation. Also, programs that have shown proof of concept in the pilot phase should be invested in and scaled up to reach more girls, their families, and community. In order to do this, we can build on the World Health Organization's systematic review of evaluated child marriage prevention programs, which identifies promising programs that have been successful in delaying age of marriage attitudes, norms, and behaviors, and improving the lives and well-being of married girls. While we must remember that no country, including our own, is unaffected by child marriage, with limited resources, there must be strategic decisions about where and how to prioritize investments. Because of this, we must build on and amplify investments already being made in high prevalence countries and regions. There are a number of considerations that may influence the selection of hotspots. In addition to child marriage prevalence, which is just one, Other opportunities are things like maternal mortality, under 5 mortality, female adult literacy, and unmet need for contraception. Where is there an enabling legal environment? And where is the US government and other donors already working and initiatives that could be strengthened to address child marriage? And again, it bears repeating, it's important programs work with both married and unmarried girls at risk. Efforts to create programs that employ best practices and that are data-driven and target hotspots. We must also keep in mind there's 5 key programmatic strategies, often implemented in tandem. The first of which is to work directly with married girls or girls at risk for early marriage, offering them information, skills, and support networks. The second of which is to educate and mobilize parents, religious and traditional leaders, and community members. The third, enhance the accessibility and quality of schooling for girls. Offer economic support and incentives for girls and their families. And the fifth of which is fostering an enabling legal and policy environment. Next slide, please. The World Health Organization's guidelines, which I mentioned previously on preventing early pregnancy and poor reproductive health outcomes among adolescents, echo many of our recommendations and underline how ending child marriage has a multiplier effect on girls' lives. These guidelines should be implemented as part of our efforts to end child marriage. Finally, as the world looks towards shaping the post-2015 development framework, governments should prioritize and support international efforts to ensure that adolescent girls, with a particularly strong focus on ending child marriage and supporting married adolescents, are key elements of the negotiations on the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2013 Millennium Development Goal Review, and the regional and global meetings on the International Conference on Population and Development Beyond 2014 review process. Child marriage has directly hindered the achievement of 6 of the 8 MDGs, and women and girls around the world, as well as their families and communities, cannot afford to be left out of the next development agenda. Adolescent girls, particularly very young adolescents, aged 10 to 14 years old, remain largely unaccounted for in development policies and programs. Children's rights and safe transitions to adulthood are relevant for all countries' development efforts and should be prioritized. We were heartened to see that the high-level panel report includes ending child marriage as a target, and we call upon all governments to support its inclusion in the final framework. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with all of you and the opportunity for Girls Not Brides USA to think through some of these opportunities before us so that we can collectively work together to ensure that all girls have the opportunity to live healthy, safe, educated, and empowered lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Andrew, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here. See, I knew I needed that water. I'm supposed to talk about the evidence that works to prevent child marriage, but I think that I would like to focus a little bit on that, and some of the points have already been made by both Carla and Jen. What I'd like to do is both present the evidence and talk a little bit about strategy, because I think the title of my talk today should be really seizing the moment. Because I think where we are, and many of you have been with me, I know I've been working on this for a decade and a half, and I see many faces here, and we're feeling very good about where we are, but we also want to feel really good about where we go. And I think that we are at a point where we have won some victories. The issue is on the agenda enough that everybody wants to talk about it. The question is, does everybody want to do something about it? And that's where we need to be. So I think that I'll give you a little bit of history, because I think it's really in the late 90s and early 2000 that child marriage emerged as a strategic advocacy issue. And part of it was that adolescent reproductive health was under siege a little bit politically, and many of us were looking at how we can continue the work that had begun with Beijing and ICPD in the mid 1990s. And I think it was almost a deliberate decision because, believe it or not, in the population field, the issue of early marriage had existed for quite a long time. But child marriage as a concept, really, we associated with in South Asia, maybe 5-year-olds getting married. And the coining of the term child marriage and linking it to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and saying under 18 is child marriage, under 18 children getting married is a violation of girls' rights and children's right, was quite a strategic and deliberate step. Go ahead. So one of the issues I think we really seized upon, and I find it interesting that over time how we present the numbers evolve. So, early on we were talking about one of the big issues is how many girls get married as children. And, right now the most recent estimates are 70 million of the 20 through 24-year-olds alone. But then it's not just the percentages, but the actual numbers. And this chart in the evidence review that we did when I was at ICRW with WHO, it really shows that, you can have countries where 70% of the girls get married as children, but then you can have a country like India where less than 50% do, but it's a really big country and there are a lot of girls, and therefore just India alone or Bangladesh alone or Nigeria alone contributes such a large proportion. It's also interesting now that I'm at UNICEF, we're noticing one other very interesting number because we're linking child marriage to child survival. And UNICEF did recent estimates that if you look at women of reproductive age, 15 through 49, 400 million women were married as children. And so you can't underestimate the impact of that early marriage over the generations that has been going on in terms of denial of education, denial of reproductive health, experience of violence, and so forth. And really, that was one major strategic reason why child marriage was something that many of us who are gender advocates and adolescent girl advocates came around, because really child marriage touches so many of the sectoral priorities and this issue of the continued circle of inequalities that gets perpetuated because girls are not educated, because they're more likely to experience violence, because they're more likely to be vulnerable to HIV, because they're going to get pregnant early, because they are more likely to have higher maternal mortality and so forth. And then that perpetuates the next generation. That connection made it a very concrete gender issue, an adolescent issue to rally around. And I think that's one of the reasons for its success, why we are here today. What started emerging in the late 2000s was that, okay, we're now finally getting the issue on the agenda, but very soon people are going to then say, well, what do you want me to do? And we wanted to look at responses, and at that point, ICRW and WHO started talking about doing a systematic review. And when we started looking at just the interventions, it's actually fascinating that most of the interventions around child marriage were really in the legislative arena or the advocacy arena. And it's only with Beijing and ICPD Cairo that programmatic interventions started taking place in the 1990s. And even it's only in the 2000s that evaluations of those programs started happening. So it's fairly recent that we're starting to develop an evidence base, but we were fortunate when we did the systematic review that we were able to capture enough of an evidence base that we have something to say, something to look forward to, some strategies to encourage or discourage. I won't go into the details of the systematic review. You can read the paper. But I will tell you a little bit about the timing. And as I said, most of the evaluations have been done in the 2000s, very little before then. Most of the interventions really started in the 1990s. One really big issue of concern is that most of the interventions addressing child marriage have been at small scale. There are fairly few, and Carla mentioned the Haryana program, for example, that ICRW is currently evaluating. And there are some incidental programs, for example, the Malawi evaluation shows that there can be scale, but that's not where a lot of the attention has focused in terms of programs. And that is an interesting issue that has emerged, that many of the programs that we're doing addressing child marriage, we're doing it as part of a larger strategy to address something else. Address adolescent reproductive health, for example, or address education or other things. And some programs, and especially large ones that have evaluated child marriage interventions, actually child marriage was not the goal of the program. And even the Haryana one, where it seems like it was a goal because the cash transfer to girls is conditional and they are staying married till 18, was actually intended to be a program against sex selection of girls. So the child marriage sort of got added in. And geographically, there's also a bias because it's mostly in Asia and especially in South Asia that a lot of these programs have happened. And West Africa, where child marriage is very prevalent, for example, has very few programmatic interventions that have been undertaken or evaluated. One really good thing I think that emerged from this systematic review is that we tried to really concretely articulate what are the strategies that are being employed to address child marriage. And this is one, it's an important issue because for gender issues, typically the prescription is do everything. Do integrated approaches, do things in education, do things in health, and do everything. And part of extracting what exactly as a theory of change was intended to address child marriage was a very important fact, and often programs don't articulate their strategies very clearly, and getting that out and putting that in a published paper was, I think, important. And really we identified only 5, many of which, for example, life skills program, by their very qualitative nature, tend to have been at small scale, whereas others, such as going through schooling, going through education programs, has been more rare and has only picked up speed in the last 5 to 6 years, which is a good thing because, education is a platform that can really be addressed. Similarly, cash transfer or social protection programs are only more recently being examined. I'm not going to go through the specifics of each types of program. Again, you can read the paper, but it tells you of the specific interventions that different program strategies have been employing. Often a lot of community mobilization, sort of a door-to-door community mobilization, or as I said, very qualitative building of girls' skills, providing them with safe spaces is a part, or offering incentives. Keep going, Michal. Okay. Or offering incentives for girls to stay in school, or offering their parents incentives, are strategies that have been implied. And there are different metrics of success, and we looked at both attitudinal change and behavioral change. And I think what's fascinating about these results is often people say that, on gender, we tend to change attitudes but not behavior. In this case, we found the opposite. Mm-hmm. The interventions had more positive results with regard to behavioral change and less positive results with regard to attitudinal change, which is a little bit worrisome because a large part of changing child marriage is changing social norms, which really involves changing attitudes. And it's also a little bit of concern that the interventions that tried to change attitudes were the ones that were less rigorously evaluated, whereas the interventions that, or at least the evaluations that examined behavioral change, had more rigor to them. And out of all of that, we thought that the coalesced evidence was strongest around 2 strategies. One was the empowering of girls with information, life skills, and social networks. And Annabelle will tell you more about some of the work that she and others have been doing in that regard. It's definitely a strong strategy, not flaw-proof, but the question is, how do you take it to scale? And so that's the issue that we're going to have to now think about it. How do you bring some of that either into education, formal or non-formal systems, or other channels for scaling it up? The other strategy that seems to be showing some promise is the issue of incentives for education. Now, as I said, that there are strategies such as the conditional cash transfer program in India that have not been evaluated. And I think that there are a couple others that are emerging that are not part of this pool that we need to think about. And so looking forward, I think the issue is going to be, first and foremost, this we need to come head on, face to face with the issue of education, of girls' education. What is it about girls' education that will really change child marriage? When girls are in school, do parents then just start looking at them as children? You know, if a 13-year-old is in school, does it create a normative shift on its own right because all the girls are now going to school? B, do they learn something then there that empowers them and makes them not want to get married or negotiate not getting married? Or the parents now see this as an investment that they really need to keep making. So really understanding that better and really measuring those outcomes better is going to be very, very key with regard to the types of interventions that we do with regard to education. An important element that at UNICEF that we're now looking at with regard to education, because this falls very much within our domain, is can we do sort of hard interventions as well as soft interventions? So for example, one reason girls don't go to school is because they experience violence, right? And who wants to send their daughter to school if she's going to be raped or molested, or horrible things are going to happen to her? And the interventions all tend to be around raising community awareness or accountability of teachers who are exploitative or other situations like that. But interventions to provide safe transportation for girls, for example, could very easily address the violence issue or having more female teachers in certain countries. For example, Africa has very high proportions of primary male school teachers. So there are hard interventions that we can really look at and start scaling up in that light. And of course, the other big area of change that we haven't been looking at is media, social media, and the power of sort of technology for creating the buzz and the social change that we're looking for. We don't have to necessarily go community by community raising awareness. We can do it in dramatic ways in this day of technology and change. And I look forward to talking to you all more about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for our speakers in this first panel. I think they covered a lot of ground in very little time, and I think really set the stage for how far we've come in the last decade, really understanding more of the background of the historical process of programming and the policy environment. We have a few minutes for questions, and we'll take those from the audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question. I believe the microphone will be brought to you. Am I right? And when you receive the microphone, am I right about that? I think. Please just very briefly introduce yourself, your name and affiliation, and try to be brief with your questions so that we have time for our speakers to respond. Hands again. Thank you.
This has been very, very interesting. Is this on?
Yes. Can you just introduce yourself?
I'm Marilyn Hoskins, and my daughter runs an NGO called Coalition for Economic Empowerment here in Washington, D.C. And what I was wondering was, are any of your programs dealing with the problem in the United States? Many of the girls have sex in order to get protection from the boys in the group, and they get pregnant very, very young. They're not all married, but they're family members by the time they're sometimes 13 and even 11. So I'm just wondering if there is any kind of effort toward those people in the United States.
Let's take 2 more questions and then we'll respond to all 3. Any other questions in the audience? All the way in the back.
Hi, thank you, and thank you all for terrific presentations. I'm Michelle Maloney-Kitts from Together for Girls. And my question for you is kind of twofold. One is that looking at the actual data, what we do know now is that the number of girls who experience, we have some data from Together for Girls that shows that 1 in 4 girls in the countries where we've done surveys has an unwanted sexual experience, actually 1 in 3 before the age of 18, and 1 in 4 girls' first sexual experience is forced, often not necessarily in the context of child marriage, although the child marriage piece is obviously, endorsed culturally in ways that perhaps child rape is not. But across the board, there's probably 2 to 3 times more girls being raped before the age of 18 than there are being married. And the cycle that you showed is quite exactly the same. So I'm just curious, how do you position child marriage within this broader context of girls really being unsafe anywhere and quite subject to a great deal of violence? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take 1 more question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mariam Ishaq from University of Pennsylvania. Thank you. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing in different countries, including my own. I'm from Pakistan. I just want to ask you, how do you deal with the religious leaders? Like you said, that there are different responses from different communities. For instance, in Islam, I know that there's a practice of child marriage because of the fact that the Messenger of God basically married child brides in order to spread Islam. So how do you deal with that concept in other religions as well? How do the religious leaders respond to that? Because that sort of contradicts the education and the religious aspect. Thank you.
Thank you. Anji?
Sure. I'm not sure, the Together for Girls question, I think that, I'm not sure if the numbers make sense to me, that 3 times as many are experiencing sexual exploitation, but I'd love to know more about the data. I do think that there are different levels of formalization of sexual violation of girls and exploitation of girls, not just sexually, but in term economically, socially, and so forth, their disempowerment. And child marriage is one obvious one, but there are others. And I think we do have to keep the connections in mind, as well as the points of separation. So there is, I think it is important that, for example, just the sexual exploitation or sexual violation of girls has overlapping issues with child marriage, but there are also important differences. If we do mission creep to the point that we say, again, all the issues are encumbered and we need to address all of them, I think that sets us up for failure, because really with the resources and the people and the energy that's there, you can't do all of those things. What we do need to look at is what are catalytic factors that might address more than one outcome. So very often, for example, there are lots of places in which sexual exploitation of girls as well as child marriage has gone down. There are countries and there are experiences. What were the catalytic factors? What were the 1 or 2 or 3 things that people did that really changed the game, rather than what were the 200 things that you had to do to just get it right? And I think that the bottom line for that really is all about, can you take things like education, can you take things like social sanctions for not accepting the fact that girls, are just the point of vulnerability of girls, that, okay, they're just for the taking. How do you change those norms? And where historically have they changed very successfully? There are plenty of places it's not okay to sexually violate girls. It's not okay even in places like Pakistan, I think your point is well taken that you can convince religious leaders. They're not all monolithic. You can also get a pretty strong backlash in some of the communities that people have been working, and UNICEF has found that, for example, not just with child marriage, but for polio vaccine, for you're getting health workers shot because you're giving kids a polio vaccine. And again, gender is a very vulnerable point there. It was women health workers in many cases who were out there. So you do have, but the point is that when parents just see that, sending my daughter to school is more important than the fact that all of those things are going to happen, and we're going to stand together to not put up with that, they will change. I mean, look at the shifts that have happened in the last 40 years in girls' schooling around the world. There were places where it was just not acceptable to do, and now, most people would look at you. Of course, why wouldn't you send girls to school? There are very few places where the idea of not sending girls to school is no longer accepted. So I think we have to look at those catalysts, and sometimes, yes, they will address other violation of their rights and their experience as well.
Thank you, Anju.
Yeah, and just to quickly comment on the question about child marriage in the United States, yes, you're absolutely right. Child marriage is an issue, as is adolescent teen pregnancy. Many of the same root factors are causing it in different contexts, but I would also say within the United States, there are organizations who are working very hard on the issue, particularly as it relates to U.S. citizens being forced to marry overseas, which is often how it materializes. It also tends to happen within diaspora communities. So communities where it was practiced within their own community and their country, they come to the United States and they continue to practice early and forced marriage. So clearly it is an issue. Tahiri Justice Center is who I'd recommend taking a look at. They did a recent survey about the prevalence of child marriage within the country as well, so you can get a better sense of where it's being practiced and some of the responses for it. Just to touch quickly on the religious leaders question, obviously religious leaders need to be seen as an ally and a partner in ending the practice. That's one of the reasons why that I emphasized, to the extent that I did, the importance of investing in local indigenous organizations who may be the best poised to navigate some of the cultural, traditional, and religious context in which the child marriage is practiced. Also, to break down some of the barriers by which culture, tradition, and religion is used as an excuse, whether it's to practice early and forced marriage or practice gender-based violence or any of the number of gender inequities that women and girls face throughout their lives, this being one aspect of it. And then finally, on the question about the data and more girls being experiencing sexual violence outside of marriage than within marriage, obviously this discussion is focused about girls who are forced into marriage against their will, and any girl who's experiencing sexual violence, whether it's within the context of marriage or outside of the context of marriage, needs to be addressed. And it certainly isn't a question of which is more important or more pressing. It's different strategies, but it's all part and parcel, kind of why I was framing it in the bigger frame of ensuring that all girls have the opportunities that they need. And obviously, early and forced marriage is one of the key barriers by which they would not be able to achieve those things. And experiencing sexual violence, whether it's a family member, whether it's a neighbor, et cetera, also has incredibly negative outcomes for her overall well-being in her future. So definitely need to be addressing it in those contexts as well.
Do we have time for another round? We have a few more minutes. We'll take 3 more questions from the audience. Again, please be brief with your question and your introduction of yourself. Thank you.
Yes, hello, thank you. My name is Rugi Diallo, and I work for JPIGO, affiliated to Johns Hopkins University. And my question is the following. What would be your reflections on the reasons behind the fact that most of African countries have now celebrated their 50th year of independence in the years between 2012 2013, and as you were rightfully mentioning it, there are very few programs in Africa, in West Africa particularly, that are addressing this question, while it has been an issue that has been talked about since the very early beginning of independences, since the 1960s. I recall my mother, who was born in 1928, who did have to fight being married at the age of 6. And today, her daughter, I'm seeing nieces and cousins back home who are still having to fight that. And I am like, this is a huge span of time for fighting still the same issue. And today, we talk more about such programs in Southeast Asia and in other parts of the world than really concretely in Africa. What would be your explanation and thoughts on that? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Charlotte Feldman Jacobs from PRB. So, Andrew, you touched a little bit on the nature of education. And I think part of that discussion, doesn't that have to include sexuality education, lest we end up with pretty dire unintended consequences of keeping girls out of marriage through secondary school? And then, Jennifer, does that lose you a lot of your policy makers and partners in legislative bodies and religious organizations?
We'll take one more question.
Hello, thank you, panelists. My name's Angel. I'm an intern in the office of the senior coordinator for women. Let's see, I gotta get it all wrong. Okay, women's equality and no, gender equality and women's empowerment. Dr. Capel is just here. Anyway, I my question is, have you guys engaged women who are survivors of child marriage, and have you done work to mobilize them to help them become leaders that would lead the I guess movement to help end child marriage and be speakers on the children's behalf? I think they should be involved. So I was wondering if you did any work with that.
Thank you. Okay. Jennifer, can we start with you?
Sure.
What do you say?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll start with mobilizing survivors, because that's something that's actually very exciting and near and dear to myself and the International Women's Health Coalition. So absolutely, women and girls who have experienced this themselves are some of the best advocates, not only on their own behalf, but about what needs to change within their own communities so that other girls don't have to experience what they've had to experience. It needs to be done in a usually they at that point they're self-empowered. They themselves received services. They themselves founded an organization. So I'm thinking about the extreme north of Cameroon, a pod, which is founded by child marriage survivors, and they then go out in the community and educate about their experiences and work with other girls to try to prevent it from happening with them. Working in the schools, when girls are missing, they'll look at why these girls are not in school anymore and try to ensure that they're not married off, etc. So absolutely working with survivors in a non-tokenistic way that's empowering for them and for their own benefit as well is a critical tool. In terms of the comprehensive sexuality education question, there's varying political will for it. I think, in some circumstances you think about it having been scaled up in Nigeria. And, while the curriculum isn't where it needs to be at this point, the fact that it has been scaled up and is in several states of Nigeria, if it can happen there, it could happen in many different places. Pakistan comes to mind as well. AHUNG is one organization that's working in the country to expand access to comprehensive sexuality education in a very conservative environment. They've also been able to navigate some of the politics very gently to do so. But you're right, comprehensive sexuality education is absolutely critical intervention. And it's not just about disease prevention. It's not just about how to avert HIV or not become pregnant or how your body works. It's about what your rights are, to actually know you have the right not to hit. And equally important, boys learn they don't have the right to hit. You have the right to not be touched in places you don't want to touch. You have the right to an education. So when we're talking about building the skills and assets of girls, comprehensive sexuality education, however you might call it, is a critical cornerstone for her not only realizing what her rights are, but also key questions she may not ever be able to ask family or her community about her sexuality, about her sexual and reproductive health. So absolutely critical. And I think, again, local indigenous organizations and others have been able to navigate that political landscape. And it really requires a country by country, situation by situation analysis of the ways in which to get it instituted. But yes, absolutely it can be a trigger, particularly the way in which sometimes it's described or the way it's perceived. But I think when you break down the curriculum about what you're teaching, age appropriate curricula about what you're teaching, It's All One comes to mind as a curriculum that has a human rights and gender empowerment element to it, which is absolutely critical. Some sex ed curriculums don't contain that part. And when it doesn't have that transformative gender norm change that we're looking for both internally and externally.
Okay, so maybe I'll address the question about why not Africa, 50 years and so forth. I think that we do have to recognize, and you raise a really important point, that the overall arching macro environment is very important for figuring out what we can do, how much we can do, and where we can do it. So if you look at the countries that had child marriage and it went away, historically, most of them didn't do intervention programs at all. Social and economic and demographic change made it happen. So you look at Taiwan, or you look at Indonesia, you look at China, you look at the West. I mean, in Victorian times, child marriage was quite common, and to older men. I mean, those patterns were there. In most of those cases, people did not actively do a program that said, make child marriage go away when social and economic and political change was happening in those countries. And often in some countries, it was Taiwan, it was the economic triggers, an export-oriented economy. In China, it was a political system that just said, you will not marry before 21, and in that system, the government enforced that. So you have different contexts, different historical circumstances, and certainly in a lot of Africa, that whole overall momentum for social and economic and political progress, when that has been lacking, then child marriage is part of it. And that's one of the arguments we're saying, that in some ways, if you look at a country, if it's not moving forward, well, women are probably disadvantaged there, and child marriage is one very clear indicator of that disadvantage. That said, there are African countries where things are happening. That Nigeria was a very good example. You can have many years of stagnation, and then a pickup. Political and economic circumstances do change. Education in Nigeria right now is at a different crossroads than it has been at time. Kenya is another example where you have to say things are happening, and it's you're at a point where you really need to seize the moment. On the opposite side, you have a country like Bangladesh, where so much investment has gone historically. I mean, everything possible that you can imagine that has been done to empower women has been done there. And after so many years, women are better off than they would be. But would we say they're dramatically empowered? I'm not sure. And after scholarship programs and so forth, you still have early marriage. You don't have very early marriage anymore, and that's a point I think Annabelle might also want to talk about. In some places, the intervention is going to only yield you that you don't have 12 and 13-year-olds getting married, but you still have 15 and 16-year-olds getting married. So we need to look at this very, very carefully. The issue of comprehensive sexuality education. I know this is probably not the place to say this, and I, being a very strong advocate of reproductive rights, I'm still going to go on a limb and say I don't think comprehensive sexuality education is an essential part of education in order to delay marriage. There are way too many. I mean, the connection between just pure schooling and marriage is so demonstrably strong. It is the single biggest preventative to schooling is it. And, we have decades of data now showing that. To think that you would have to have sexuality education to make that happen, I don't believe it. Yes, you may have if you're creating the kind of change, you may increase demand for sexuality education, and that may follow. But that you'd have to have sexuality education to delay early marriage, I don't believe it. Now, there may be places, but no, I really don't think so. Again, I think it comes down to, what do we ask for? Do we ask for things that we're going to do that are going to trigger other change, or do we try to do everything in one shot, which is impossible?
Wow. I don't know, Jennifer, would you want to say a few more words, or should we end this panel on this? Let's end this panel on this very intriguing note, and that will make an intriguing transition to the next panel. So give us just a minute to change personnel, and we will be right back.
Actually, while we're changing personnel up here, I do want to say 3 little words to all of you. It's not what you think. It's reception to follow, so please do stick around. I also wanted to mention we have an overflow room downstairs, so for folks who are sitting on the ground or on the side, please do feel free to go down to the 4th floor if you need a comfy chair. Also, I see there are very few chairs mixed